Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to operate on a completely different wavelength? They pick up on things that shouldn't be noticeable, catch inconsistencies in stories before anyone else does, and possess an almost supernatural ability to see right through you. If you've encountered someone like this, there's a good chance you've met an INFJ, and today we're uncovering the psychological architecture behind their legendary deception detection abilities. If you've ever attempted to hide something from an INFJ, you already understand that peculiar feeling of complete exposure. These individuals don't need advanced training or investigative tools. They simply possess a multifaceted cognitive system that operates simultaneously across multiple channels of human communication. So what exactly is happening in their minds? Why do INFJs possess such a formidable ability to expose dishonesty, decode human behavior, and penetrate surface-level presentations? Let's explore the fascinating science and psychology behind why INFJs represent perhaps the most perceptive personality type when it comes to detecting deception. 1. Decoding the intuitive apparatus: how INFJs process information differently. The foundation of an INFJ's lie detection capability rests on something that can't be taught in a classroom or learned from a textbook: their intuitive processing system. This isn't merely a vague feeling or an educated guess. We're discussing a genuine neurological capacity that enables them to synthesize information in ways that diverge dramatically from how average people process reality. Imagine intuition as a sophisticated surveillance system installed within the mind. Most individuals possess a basic version that detects obvious threats and significant behavioral shifts. INFJs, however, operate with military-grade equipment capable of identifying minute vibrations in the human experience. They're constantly intercepting data points that remain invisible to others: the millisecond quiver in someone's voice, the fractional shift in pupil dilation, the palpable energy transformation that sweeps through a room when tension enters it. What amplifies this capacity even further is that INFJs frequently can't articulate precisely why they've reached a particular conclusion. They'll communicate something like, "There's something I can't quite put into words, but this situation doesn't sit right with me," and weeks later, you discover their wordless concern was completely justified. This isn't paranormal activity. Rather, it's their neurological system connecting disparate pieces of information at velocities that outpace their conscious awareness. This intuitive apparatus becomes increasingly sophisticated throughout their lifetime. During childhood, they're absorbing behavioral patterns and social conventions at an accelerated rate. Throughout adolescence, they're developing increasingly nuanced comprehension of emotional dynamics and unspoken communication. By adulthood, they've accumulated thousands of hours documenting human conduct. Their brains have essentially transformed into highly calibrated machines for identifying behavioral patterns and psychological inconsistencies. 2. The microscopic communication leak: understanding microexpressions and what they reveal. Among the most significant reasons why deception fails in the presence of an INFJ is their extraordinary competence in deciphering body language, particularly the almost impossible-to-control microexpressions that betray genuine emotional states. Here's the critical insight: your body communicates truths that your carefully selected words cannot disguise. INFJs demonstrate particular sensitivity to what behavioral scientists term microexpressions: the involuntary facial movements that occur in fractions of a second before an individual can regulate them. These microexpressions function as windows into authentic emotional experience. Perhaps someone is displaying a smile, yet their eye muscles remain completely relaxed, suggesting the smile is manufactured rather than genuine. Perhaps someone verbally insists everything is satisfactory, but their jaw tensed almost imperceptibly moments earlier. Perhaps someone claims to be experiencing joy, but their eyes remained unexpressive for that critical split second before they could manufacture the appropriate response. The analysis extends well beyond facial movements. INFJs meticulously observe hand movements, shoulder positioning, spinal alignment, and the overall kinetic patterns of human movement. They register when someone characteristically animated suddenly becomes subdued and reserved. They perceive the nervous self-stimulation that individuals believe remains undetected. They observe modifications in breathing patterns that precede dishonesty. Whereas most people are mechanically processing the vocabulary being presented, the INFJ is executing a comprehensive analysis of every somatic signal being transmitted. The remarkable aspect is that INFJs execute this analysis automatically, without conscious deliberation. They're not mentally narrating, "Now I should examine their microexpressions for indicators of deception." The process unfolds instantaneously. Their neurological systems function like high-resolution recording devices documenting every infinitesimal detail. Subsequently, when they experience a premonition regarding someone's trustworthiness, it frequently originates from their unconscious mind having absorbed enormous quantities of these minute signals. This presents a particularly challenging scenario for individuals attempting dishonesty directly with an INFJ. You might have meticulously rehearsed your narrative, but you cannot practically prepare your physiology. You might regulate your language perfectly, but your neuromuscular system typically operates according to its own agenda. INFJs witness the complete performance, not merely the dialogue component. 3. The emotional resonance factor. How INFJs feel what others hide. What genuinely distinguishes INFJs from other perceptive individuals is their exceptional emotional attunement, a capacity that transcends mere intellectual comprehension and enters the realm of genuine emotional sensation. They don't simply understand emotions academically, they actually experience them on a deeper psychological stratum than the majority of people. INFJs possess the capacity to access other individuals' emotional worlds. When someone is experiencing psychological distress, the INFJ doesn't engage in purely intellectual analysis. They physiologically sense it. They can identify authentic happiness masquerading beneath artificial cheerfulness. They can perceive melancholy concealed underneath a performed smile. They can sense rage simmering beneath a calm exterior. This emotional perceptiveness becomes extraordinarily potent when confronting dishonesty. Consider the fundamental truth regarding deception. Most lies originate from emotional sources. Individuals fabricate narratives because they experience fear, shame, self-protection instincts, or manipulative intentions. These emotional substrates produce a recognizable psychological signature that an INFJ's sensitive emotional apparatus detects instantly. It's analogous to possessing the capacity to detect the fear scent or shame residue connected to dishonesty. Contemplate the internal experience of constructing a falsehood, particularly a significant one. Typically, psychological turbulence manifests internally. Possibly you experience nervousness. Perhaps guilt emerges. Possibly anxiety materializes regarding disclosure. An INFJ perceives this psychic turbulence radiating outward from you. It functions like they're observing the psychological fingerprints that deception inevitably leaves. This emotional consciousness additionally helps INFJs comprehend psychological motivations. They possess inherent curiosity regarding human behavior and causation. Consequently, even during instances of deception, an INFJ frequently considers the underlying drivers. Is this individual experiencing insecurity? Are they operating from fear? Are they attempting to construct an impression? This elevated comprehension of psychological architecture renders successful deception increasingly improbable. 4. The pattern recognition architecture, connecting dots others never see. INFJs operate with what might be characterized as a pattern recognition framework, a neurological system perpetually engaged in identifying connections and behavioral sequences throughout human interaction. This capacity demonstrates remarkable utility when identifying dishonesty. Imagine someone delivers one narrative variation on Monday, followed by a slightly divergent narrative by Friday. Numerous individuals might remain completely unaware of the inconsistency, or they might have forgotten the original version entirely. An INFJ, however, will retain complete recollection of every component. More profoundly, they'll immediately recognize that contradiction as significant. The recognition process doesn't necessitate deliberate memorization. It operates as an automatic function of their psychological structure. They naturally preserve these particulars and immediately trigger an internal warning system when something misaligns. They monitor behavioral patterns, communication habits, and established interaction protocols. Consequently, when someone suddenly behaves atypically or tells a story contradicting their established patterns, the INFJ's internal detection mechanism activates. This pattern recognition capacity extends to behavioral trajectories across different situations and relationships. An INFJ observes patterns in how people navigate their social networks, the justifications they consistently employ, the recurring mistakes they make. These behavioral sequences paint a comprehensive portrait, and that portrait generally communicates significant truths regarding an individual's authentic character. The extraordinary advantage here relates to the reality that patterns resist fabrication more effectively than individual narratives. You might successfully construct one isolated lie, but sustaining dishonesty demands remembering every detail and maintaining narrative consistency across all circumstances. Most individuals collapse under this psychological weight because the fabrication ultimately clashes with their genuine behavioral patterns or documented history. INFJs identify these inconsistencies because they're examining the complete landscape, not isolated moments disconnected from context. 5. The authenticity imperative, why truth-seeking makes them better detectors. INFJs operate within a fundamental value framework constructed entirely around authenticity and truthfulness. These aren't individuals casually manufacturing falsehoods or demonstrating comfort with widespread dishonesty. This value system profoundly influences their capacity to recognize deception. When you fundamentally prioritize truth, you develop heightened sensitivity to falsification. It's comparable to how individuals with strong cleanliness standards detect contamination more rapidly. INFJs possess neurological wiring that strongly resonates with authenticity and realness, so artificial behavior registers as distinctly aberrant. It generates psychological discomfort in ways that might not disturb individuals more tolerant of casual dishonesty. This fundamental value orientation additionally means INFJs contemplate truthfulness and deception with greater frequency than average individuals. They're continuously examining authenticity. They're observing when individuals present genuinely versus when they're activating protective personas. All this psychological activity concentrated around truthfulness and falsification transforms them into superior deception detectors. Additionally, INFJs characteristically demonstrate directness when addressing dishonesty they've identified. They're uncomfortable permitting it to persist unaddressed. This directness frequently astonishes people precisely because the INFJ will introduce a lie or inconsistency in ways suggesting they've analyzed it extensively. They're rarely making instantaneous judgments. They've invested significant mental energy, observed the complete behavioral sequence, and made a deliberate decision to address the matter. 6. The active reception protocol, listening and observation as investigative tools. Whereas most individuals spend their conversational moments formulating their subsequent contribution to the discussion, INFJs are genuinely attending to communication. This represents considerably more than passive hearing. We're discussing comprehensive, multidimensional listening engagement. During an INFJ's interaction with another person, they're not merely processing vocabulary. They're simultaneously examining vocal tonality, intensity emphasis, what's being articulated, and conspicuously what remains unspoken. They're monitoring which subjects provoke defensive reactions. They're recognizing when someone's psychological state shifts. They're detecting voice repetition patterns. Does someone repeatedly emphasize the identical phrase because they're uncertain about credibility? INFJs typically demonstrate a questioning nature. They're inherently curious, which translates into deeper investigation. Consequently, when someone provides a questionable response, the INFJ's natural inclination is requesting elaboration. During this clarification process, they frequently identify the inconsistencies that more superficial listeners would overlook. This engaged listening approach also enables INFJs to identify hesitation patterns. When someone pauses prior to responding, the INFJ registers it. When someone appears uncertain regarding their own narrative, the INFJ perceives it. These momentary delays frequently signal that someone's generating a response spontaneously rather than retrieving genuine memory, or they're retrieving a previously constructed lie rather than experiencing authentic recollection. The genuine competitive advantage involves remaining observant at intensities where most individuals relax their vigilance. Standard practice involves most people relaxing when they believe they're unobserved. However, INFJs maintain perpetual attentiveness. They're constantly monitoring, perpetually listening. This persistent engagement renders successful deception practically impossible. 7. The psychological cartography, understanding the landscape where deception originates. INFJs excel at comprehending precisely why people engage in deception. They recognize that falsification habitually emerges from psychological positions characterized by susceptibility, terror, or internal conflict. This psychological comprehension actually strengthens their deception identification capabilities rather than creating vulnerability. Because INFJs understand the psychological geography where dishonesty germinates, they can anticipate when someone might engage in deception. When someone occupies a psychologically exposed position, the INFJ experiences heightened attentiveness. When someone radiates apprehension, the INFJ calibrates their deception detection sensitivities accordingly. They comprehend that individuals fabricate when confronted with fear regarding judgment, social exclusion, or repercussions. What proves particularly fascinating is that this compassionate psychological comprehension doesn't generate accessibility for deception. Instead, it amplifies perceptiveness. They're monitoring for the fear indicators or vulnerability manifestations that frequently precede dishonest communication. They're registering when someone demonstrates defensive reactions, which characteristically indicates either pending dishonesty or already occurring deception. INFJs similarly comprehend the mechanics of shame. They recognize that individuals commonly fabricate narratives to conceal shame or embarrassment. Therefore, when they identify shame markers, they instantaneously suspect deceptive activity. The subtle facial flushing, the downward gaze, the voice volume reduction. These communicate shame, and INFJs connect shame to deception with remarkable consistency. This psychological comprehension functions as supplementary equipment in their detection arsenal. While the majority of individuals evaluate whether a narrative demonstrates logical coherence, INFJs evaluate the psychological and emotional architecture simultaneously. It's a considerably more comprehensive evaluation, and comprehensive evaluations reveal authentic reality. 8. The persona recognition framework, detecting when social masks become obstacles to truth. INFJs possess sophisticated comprehension that every individual presents multiple versions of themselves depending on circumstance. They recognize that individuals deploy different psychological personas across various social contexts. What distinguishes them is their remarkable capacity to identify inconsistencies between authentic identity and presented persona, particularly when dishonesty stretches that inconsistency too far. Each human maintains what might be termed an authentic self and a contextual self, the version they display to their environment. INFJs demonstrate particular effectiveness at recognizing the distance between these two identity manifestations. When that distance becomes excessive, when someone's persona contradicts their genuine character, the INFJ perceives it. What typically causes personas to destabilize is generally pressure or the requirement to engage in deception. When someone's manufacturing a false narrative, they frequently intensify their persona maintenance, holding that mask with greater effort. This heightened effort becomes observable to attentive observers. INFJs perceive this intensified psychological effort. They observe when someone's expending more energy than usual to sustain a particular presentation or narrative. INFJs additionally recognize that maintaining false narratives consistently extracts psychological expense. Deception generates fatigue. Consequently, they notice when someone's psychological resources deplete during dishonest communication, or when they manifest relief following a deceptive episode. They perceive the psychological toll that narrative fabrication generates. This represents yet another deception identification mechanism, recognizing the energetic cost associated with maintaining dishonesty. 9. The perspective simulation capacity, thinking like others to detect deviation. A particularly remarkable INFJ capability involves their sophisticated perspective taking, their capacity to mentally position themselves within another individual's psychological experience. They can envision themselves as the other person, comprehending their worldview, their driving motivations, their psychological anxieties. This sophisticated cognitive capacity proves surprisingly effective for deception identification. When INFJs simulate being another individual mentally, they frequently develop predictions regarding how that individual would authentically respond within a specific scenario. Consequently, when someone communicates something failing to align with what the INFJ's mental simulation predicted, warning indicators activate. It functions as though the INFJ possesses an internal behavioral model, enabling them to immediately recognize deviations from that model. For illustration, if an INFJ understands that a person highly values their public reputation and status, and that individual describes behavior that would demolish that reputation, the INFJ probably thinks, "This narrative doesn't correspond with what I understand regarding this individual." They're employing their comprehension of the person's core values and psychological architecture to evaluate narrative probability. This perspective simulation capacity additionally helps INFJs determine what concealed reality underlies a fabricated narrative. They can mentally engage with the question, if this narrative isn't truthful, what's the actual situation? And frequently arrive at conclusions approximating reality. Their perspective-taking capacity permits them to contemplate multiple possibilities and recognize which possibility demonstrates the highest probability. 10. The extended observation timeline, how patience becomes a deception detection tool. Another characteristic that positions INFJs as formidable deception detectors involves their inherent patience and willingness to maintain extended observation periods. INFJs don't operate under pressure to immediately finalize judgments. They'll observe. They'll examine over prolonged time frames. They demonstrate remarkable comfort permitting circumstances to gradually reveal their authentic nature. This patience means that even when an INFJ can't immediately substantiate that someone's engaged in deception, they'll maintain their investigative observation. They'll preserve the suspicious moments in their psychological storage. They'll remain observant for corroborating evidence. And fundamentally, most falsehoods eventually disintegrate. When they do, the INFJ has probably been contemplating it for considerable time. This extended timeline observation additionally positions INFJs to recognize deception patterns that might remain invisible during any isolated time frame. Someone might communicate individual lies appearing credible independently, but when you examine the comprehensive behavioral sequence across weeks or months, an undeniable pattern materializes. INFJs conceptualize reality across these extended temporal frameworks, making pattern recognition considerably more accessible. Furthermore, INFJs don't generally publicize every suspicion they generate. They might silently maintain their doubt while continuing observation and gathering additional evidence prior to expressing anything. This means that when they ultimately address dishonesty, they characteristically possess comprehensive evidence. They've completed their evaluation, gathered their confirmatory data, and they're psychologically certain prior to initiating conversation. 11. The convergence point. How multiple systems create an impenetrable detection matrix. The location where we genuinely comprehend the extraordinary potency of INFJ deception detection involves recognizing that it's never merely a single capability. Rather, it represents all these capacities operating in simultaneous coordination. An INFJ is simultaneously engaged in careful listening regarding what you're communicating while they're simultaneously analyzing your physiological communication and examining your microexpressions. Concurrently, they're monitoring emotional fluctuations and comparing your narrative against their stored recollections of prior conversations. Meanwhile, their intuitive system is probably registering something they can't immediately articulate, and they're running psychological simulations regarding whether your narrative remains psychologically coherent considering what they comprehend about your character. That represents substantial cognitive processing occurring instantaneously, correct? And predominantly, this transpires automatically. The INFJ isn't deliberately executing each analysis sequentially. Their neurological apparatus simply operates at elevated efficiency levels that would overwhelm most individuals if they attempted similar simultaneous processing. When all these concurrent systems direct toward a similar conclusion, that someone's communicating falsely, the situation essentially becomes unwinnable for the deceiver. There exists no single element you can artificially produce or rehearse because the INFJ is operating across numerous analysis channels simultaneously. You would require elite-level deception expertise, training in physiological communication manipulation, perfect narrative consistency, genuine emotional control, and the capacity to deceive intuitive assessment merely to remain undetected by an INFJ. 12. The practical evidence. Real scenarios where INFJ perception manifests. Let's transition this analysis from theoretical to concrete through examination of genuine circumstances where INFJ deception detection demonstrates itself. Envision an INFJ functioning within a professional environment. Their colleague insists they've dedicated the complete week to a particular project, but the INFJ observed the colleague departing early on multiple occasions and displaying stress indicators. Subsequently, the INFJ examines the project documentation and identifies that the majority of project work occurred between Sunday evening and Monday morning. The INFJ never expressed accusatory language, but they maintained clarity regarding reality. They comprehend the colleague wasn't demonstrating genuine commitment despite their assertions, and they're certainly reconsidering their relational trust. Alternatively, contemplate an INFJ in a romantic relationship. Their partner communicates that they weren't attempting to generate hurt, but the INFJ sensed the frustration within their vocal quality, observed the eye roll before it got suppressed, and recognized the sarcastic remarks, conduct that usually communicates irritation. So despite the language asserting, "I wasn't attempting to hurt you," the complete communication package articulated something entirely different. The INFJ doesn't generally pretend to accept the linguistic assertion. They'll typically address it gently. "I recognize your frustration even though your words aren't communicating that." Within friend networks, INFJs frequently emerge as individuals who comprehend the actual relational dynamics. They recognize who's masking their genuine emotional experience. They understand which individuals maintain competitive dynamics they won't openly acknowledge. They perceive who's engaging in relational criticism away from the individual's presence. They see these phenomena because they're continuously monitoring, and they're connecting relational data points that other individuals haven't bothered tracking. The closing analysis. Understanding why INFJ perception remains nearly impossible to overcome. To synthesize everything we've examined, deception fundamentally fails against INFJs because they're operating within a completely different cognitive framework than most individuals. They've developed natural intuitive sensing, sophisticated physiological communication interpretation, psychological awareness extending beyond average capacity, behavioral pattern recognition, deeply embedded commitment to truthfulness, engaged receptive capabilities, psychological comprehension, persona inconsistency identification, and remarkable patience permitting them to observe across extended periods. When you integrate all these components, you're confronted with someone who's essentially impossible to mislead. The important perspective to maintain involves recognizing this isn't fundamentally judgmental or rooted in paranoia. INFJs aren't continuously searching for deception attempting to demonstrate something negative about humanity. They're simply naturally perceptive, and their psychological architecture detects incongruence between communicated narratives and genuine meaning or feeling. It represents a cognitive advantage they maintain, and it's genuinely among the reasons individuals feel profoundly protected in INFJ presence. People recognize that with an INFJ, authenticity receives genuine reception, and the INFJ will perceive you completely, both your strengths and your less developed aspects. Should you discover yourself interacting with an INFJ, the optimal strategy remains straightforward. Communicate with complete honesty. Demonstrate authenticity. Recognize that attempting deception represents a fundamentally losing proposition because their detection mechanisms are simply too sophisticated. And genuinely, INFJs appreciate authenticity far more profoundly than most individuals, so providing them with realness constitutes precisely what they'll treasure most. Their deception detection represents not a weapon for finding wrongdoing, but rather evidence of their psychological need to connect with genuine truth. Provide them that authenticity, and you'll establish a relationship built on authentic foundation and long-term durability.